He found a stranded alien woman on a deserted island. She made him a deal he couldn't refuse. The storm had peeled the name off the side of the life raft before Marcus Hale had even stopped shaking. He'd woken with salt in his eyes and the taste of blood on his lip, lying face down on a shelf of black volcanic rock, the raft deflated and tangled around one ankle like the ocean's afterthought. The Peregrine Cross Asterisk, the survey vessel he'd been crewing for 14 months, was gone. Not sinking, not burning. Gone, in the way things go when a squall out of nowhere meets a hull that was already asking for forgiveness. He'd been asleep in his bunk. He'd woken in the water. He hadn't seen another face since. That had been 3 days ago. He'd found the island by swimming toward the only fixed point in a sky full of moving cloud, a ridge of dark rock jutting above the chop, black and bare and entirely unwelcoming. It was exactly the kind of place a man ended up when the universe decided he'd gotten too comfortable. No fresh water on the surface. He'd found a seat between 2 boulders on the second morning, barely enough to keep him upright. No usable wood. No shelter beyond a shallow overhang on the leeward side of the ridge that kept the wind off if he curled tight enough. He'd made an inventory, a waterproof case with 3 emergency flares, a multi-tool, half a protein bar Sol Truand, the clothes on his back, his boots which were still somehow on his feet. 3 flares, 3 chances to be seen. He was saving them. On the 4th morning, he climbed to the top of the ridge before the sun was fully up, because the ridge was the only high ground, and because standing still made the situation feel worse than moving. The ocean stretched in every direction without interruption, no shipping lane, no distant silhouette, nothing but the flat pewter light of early day and a horizon that didn't care about him in the slightest. He was about to climb back down when he saw her. She was in the water, about 80 meters off the northern face of the island, which was the face he never checked because the current ran hard that way and there was nothing to see. She was in the water and she was not swimming well. That was the first thought, not swimming well. The second thought arrived half a second later when the morning light moved and he got a clear look, and the second thought was considerably harder to process. She was large. Not large like a tall woman, large like a creature built at a different scale, proportioned like a human but wrong in a dozen specific ways that his brain kept trying to smooth over and kept failing. Her skin, where it caught the light, was the deep copper green of old bronze, and it had a texture to it, faintly scaled in a way that was only visible when the light hit at an angle. Her hair, if it was hair, fanned out in the water behind her in a dark mass shot through with threads of pale gold, and it moved too slowly, like it had mass to it that ordinary hair didn't. Her arms were in the water, pulling, but one of them wasn't pulling right. One of them was pulling half as hard as the other, and her course was drifting. She was injured, she was losing. Marcus Hale was not, by any assessment of his own character, a reckless man. He was a surveyor's assistant who read tide tables for pleasure and kept a 3-point anchor checklist laminated to the inside of his kit bag. He made decisions methodically and didn't particularly love the ocean to begin with. He was in the water before he finished thinking about it. The current was brutal on the northern face, exactly as advertised, and it pushed him 30 meters south of where he aimed to enter. He corrected, cutting hard across the drag, and the cold hit him like a fist. This water was cold in a way that the rest of the island's surrounding ocean wasn't, fed by something deep and dark from below. He swam hard and didn't look up until his arm hit something solid. She made a sound, low and resonant like a cello struck rather than bowed, not a scream, not a word, but something between alarm and warning. Up close she was even harder to process. She was easily 2 meters tall in the water, maybe more, and her face was, he forced himself to look at it directly, because looking away from something that big in open ocean was the worst strategy available. Her face was broadly humanoid. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, cheekbones that sat high and pronounced. But her eyes were gold, and not figuratively, solid gold irises with a black vertical pupil like a cat's, and they were fixed on him with an intensity that made the cold water feel secondary. The markings on her neck and jaw were luminescent, faintly, even in daylight, a pale copper gold that pulsed once when she saw him and then steadied. "Hey," Marcus said, which was objectively stupid, but he'd used up his smarter options getting here. "Hey. There's rock, about 70 meters back. Let me help you." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he started to wonder if she spoke anything he'd understand, or if she was deciding whether to pull him under. Then she said, in accented but functional standard, "You are human." "Guilty," he said. "Can you swim?" She didn't answer that directly. She said, "My shoulder, something in the water, I cannot use it." "Okay." He moved to her other side, the working side, and got himself under her arm where she could use him as a float rather than a drag. "Okay, kick if you can. I'll aim us." She kicked. She was strong enough, even half-compromised, that he barely had to compensate for her size. They made the distance in under 10 minutes, and when the rock came up under their feet she stood without help, though she listed badly to the injured side, and he didn't try to hold her up because something told him she'd find that worse than the pain. He led her to the overhang. She had to fold herself nearly double to fit under it, and she did it without complaint, and sat on the rock with her injured arm held close to her body and her gold eyes watching him with an expression he couldn't read. "There's water," he said. "Not much. The seep around the other side, I'll bring it." He brought it in a piece of the raft's rubberized fabric, folded into something that held shape if he didn't move fast. She drank without ceremony and didn't thank him, which he found, strangely, more reassuring than if she had. A being that was frightened of him would have managed to thank you. A being that wasn't frightened of him just drank the water. "What's wrong with the shoulder?" he asked. "Not the shoulder, below, a stinger." She turned slightly, and he saw it then. 3 parallel welts running from below her left collarbone down and under her arm, raised and angry against the bronze green of her skin, with a faint blue-black discoloration at the center of each mark. They were recent, still swelling. "Can I look?" She was quiet for a moment, then, "Yes." He looked. He didn't touch until he asked, and he asked before he did anything, and he worked carefully and without comment. He didn't have anything useful, the multi-tool didn't help here, and he had no medicine, no topical, nothing. But he could see the marks were already beginning to weep slightly at the edges, and the discoloration suggested the venom, if it was venom, was trying to move. "In the water," he said, "there were things, long, translucent, jellyfish-looking. I've been staying away from the northern side because of them." "Yes," she said, "I know what they are. I should have known better." A pause. "I was not thinking clearly." "Okay, I can try to clean it, but I've got nothing to clean with that won't make it worse." He sat back on his heels. "Does it spread? Do you know?" "It will peak," she said. "If the dose is small enough, it will peak and recede. If not," she didn't finish the sentence. "Right," he sat back. "So we wait and find out." "Yes." He looked at the welts again, then at her face, which gave him nothing. "I'm Marcus," he said. "Marcus Hale. The ship I was on went down 4 nights ago. I've been here since." She looked at him for a long moment. Her pupil, that vertical black slit, narrowed slightly in the brighter light that was now reaching the edge of the overhang. "Vel'Sotharan," she said. "My name, not the full name, the use name. Vel'Sotharaness." "Vel'Sotharan," he said it carefully. "Nessa," she said, "if it is easier." "Nessa." He tried that instead. It fit, somehow, even though it didn't really represent the sound she'd made. "How did you end up in the water?" She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, "My skiff. A navigation failure, not mechanical. I misjudged a beacon signal. The skiff is on the seafloor. I went in after it," and a pause. "The stingers were not there yesterday. They move with the thermocline." "So you're also stuck here?" "Yes." He looked out at the ocean, which continued to offer nothing in any direction. "Right," he said, "then we're both stuck here." She slept eventually, which he took as a sign the venom hadn't gone systemic in a way that would kill her quickly. She slept curled on her side with her injured arm against the rock, taking up most of the overhang, and he sat outside the shadow with his back against the rock face and watched the water. The stinger welts had peaked by late afternoon. He knew because she woke and told him so matter-of-factly, with the same flat delivery she used for everything, and because the swelling had begun to ease along the outer edges. She could move the arm again. Not fully, not without a wince she didn't bother to conceal, but the range was returning. "Thank you," she said, which was the first time she'd said it. She said it the way someone says something they haven't decided they mean yet. "I didn't do anything," he said. "I got you out of the water and brought you water, that's it." "Yes," she said, "that is what I mean." He let that sit for a moment, then, "I have 3 flares. I've been saving them for a ship or an aircraft, haven't seen either." He paused. "Do you have any way of signaling? Anything on your person that works?" She reached into a pocket he hadn't noticed, a seam in the material of what she was wearing, which wasn't fabric in any sense he recognized, more like a second skin that happened to have structure, and produced a small device flat about the size of a coin. She pressed its surface and nothing happened. She pressed it again. It gave a faint click and went dark. "Dead," she said. "The water." "Yeah," he exhaled. "Okay." Combined resources. 3 flares, a multi-tool, a torn life raft, and whatever you have. She reached into 2 more of those invisible pockets and produced a folded material that expanded into something about the size of a towel but far tougher, clearly not waterlogged despite the swim, a small sealed container with 4 tablets inside, and a knife, short-bladed and curved, that she set beside her without comment. "The tablets are nutrition," she said. "Vel'Sotharan synthesis. I don't know if they're compatible with human metabolism." "They might not poison me and they might not feed me," he said, "which is about what I've got going on regardless." The corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "Yes." "Approximately." He looked at the expanded material. "That weatherproof?" "Very." "Good. The overhang leaks when it rains, which it does every afternoon. We can rig that to keep the wet off." He picked up the multi-tool. "I can do that. If you want to," he nodded toward the seep around the rock face. "Water's around the corner, about 20 meters. You should drink more. Venom recovery." She looked at him for a moment with those gold eyes. "You are organizing," she said. "Someone has to." "Most humans who encounter me do not organize," she said. "They either run or they ask me many questions very quickly." "I've got questions," he said. "But they can wait until I've got a roof that doesn't drip on me." She stood uncurling from the space in a single motion that was surprisingly graceful for something that had been in a seepwater sleep 4 hours ago, and looked at him. "You are either very calm or very afraid," she said. "Both mostly," he said, "but being afraid doesn't fix the roof so." She was quiet for a moment. Then she walked around the rock face toward the seep, and he got to work on the roof. The rigged shelter held through the afternoon rain, which came exactly on schedule, as it apparently always did. She returned before it started and sat under the extended material without comment, while the rain hammered the rock above them and ran off the edges in small falls. She watched him eat half of one of the nutrition tablets. It tasted of nothing, which was at least not unpleasant, and then ate the other half herself when he offered it. "I should tell you something," she said, when the rain began to ease. He waited. "I have a beacon," she said, "a secondary one. It is not on my person. It is built into a subdermal node in my left forearm." She showed him the arm, the uninjured one, and there was a faint raised line there he'd taken for a scar. "It is on. It has been on since I went into the water." He processed this, and And my response time is 12 hours from the point of incident. I missed the first window. She looked at the rain. The second window is approximately 30 hours from now. He was quiet for a moment. So someone is coming. Yes, if the beacon continues to transmit. Is there a reason it would stop? The venom, if it had gone further, can interfere with the node signal. She touched the inside of her forearm, pressing lightly. It has not. The signal is still active. I checked when I woke. He sat with that for a moment. So we're here for 30 hours and then you get rescued. We, she said. They're coming for you. They will take who I direct them to take, she said, simply, like it wasn't a choice, just a fact. He looked at her. You were going to tell me that eventually anyway. Yes, she said. I was deciding when. She paused. You did not ask. Most beings told they would receive rescue ask what it will cost them. You did not ask. I figured I'd find out. She looked at him steadily. The signal nodes in this region, your vessel, the survey ship, they would have logged your loss. Your species' standard protocol is to presume crew lost after 72 hours in these waters with no recovery. You are, at this moment, officially dead. He'd known that. He'd known it since the second morning. He'd just been setting it aside to deal with later. Yeah, he said. When my vessel comes, I can bring you aboard and take you to a port your species operates out of. No complication. You resume your life. Or, he said, because there was clearly an or. Nessa turned to look at him directly. Her luminescent markings pulsed once. He was starting to read them, maybe, or starting to believe he was reading them. They seemed to do that when she was about to say something she decided to say. Or, she said, I need someone. For what? I'm a survey coordinator, she said. Not entirely unlike what you described your work as. I coordinate mapping contracts in this region, ocean systems, uninhabited islands, subsurface geological readings. I have 3 contracts outstanding. I have a crew position that was filled by my second navigator who left 2 months ago. She paused. I need someone who can read tide tables, take atmospheric readings, follow a course, and not cause me difficulties. He looked at her. You don't know if I can do any of those things. You read the current on the northern face correctly. You rigged a shelter that is holding. You organized resources under stress without wasting energy on things that couldn't be helped. She looked at the rain-washed rock. You also did not flinch from me. I was in the ocean, he said. Flinching would have been counterproductive. Yes, she said, but you have not flinched since either. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the laminated checklist inside his kit bag, which was on the seafloor. He thought about the Peregrine Cross asterisk, which was also on the seafloor. He thought about being officially dead. What does the job pay? He said. This time she did smile. It was brief, and it transformed her face in a way he wasn't entirely prepared for, and it was gone in a moment. Enough, she said. More than enough, by what I understand of your species' standards. What are the hours? Long. The contracts are in a 4-system range. We would be at sea or in transit most of the time. I'm a surveyor's assistant, he said. I'm used to being at sea most of the time. Yes, she watched him. The position also requires that you take direction from me, that you follow my schedules, my protocols, and my decisions on course and contract. If this is a difficulty. It isn't, he said. I spent 14 months taking direction from Captain Voss, who ate her breakfast in order of food group and spoke to the hull when she thought no one was watching. Following reasonable instructions from someone competent isn't a difficulty. Nessa was quiet for a moment. I eat my meals in order of temperature, she said carefully. That's significantly more rational, he said. She looked at him for another long moment, reading something in his face that he couldn't identify. Then she said, there is one other condition. Say it. The route we travel is not always simple. 3 of the 5 port stops on the contracted route are Vel'Sotharan stations. Not all Vel'Sotharan ports receive humans easily. There are those who would find a human member of a Vel'Sotharan survey crew unusual. Unusual like they'd give us paperwork trouble, or unusual like they'd try to space me. Paperwork trouble, she said. Though there was one incident, 5 years ago at Reth Station, that is less amusing in retrospect. What happened at Reth Station? A human surveyor on contract attempted to map a cave system that turned out to be a ceremonial site. He did not know. He was detained for 17 hours. That's not that bad. No, she said, but it is the kind of event that makes a captain cautious. Her gaze was level. I am cautious. I would require you to follow my briefings on each port before entry, to not wander, not investigate independently, not speak to officials without me present. You want a crew member who does the job and doesn't make extra problems for you. Yes. That's not a condition, he said. That's a job description. She looked at him for a long time. The rain had stopped. The light through the overhang's edge was turning the pale gold of late afternoon, and it caught the markings along her jaw, and they glowed warmly against the bronze green of her skin. She was, he thought, the most unsettling and the most composed being he'd ever shared a roof with, and the roof was a piece of alien material draped over a volcanic rock on an island with no name. Do we have a deal? She said. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment. He thought she might not know the gesture, and then she reached out and took it. Her hand was large and warm despite the cold water they'd both been in, and she shook once, with the firm economy of someone who had learned the gesture from documentation rather than practice. Deal, she said. The 30 hours were not wasted. By the second morning, they had a full inventory organized in order of utility. By midday, they had a signal plan for the 3 remaining flares, not to call for help, since help was coming, but to supplement the beacon if the conditions deteriorated. By early afternoon, she had shown him the navigation charts on a secondary device she'd produced from somewhere he hadn't watched closely, and he'd identified 2 of the 3 contracted survey sites from his own work on the Peregrine Cross asterisk. One was a deep-water trench system he'd helped mark the boundaries of, and one was an island group he'd photographed in the early months of the survey. You know the southern island chain, she said. Not well, we skimmed it. But I've got the visual reference, and I know the tidal pattern. That is more than my previous navigator had when he started. She studied the chart with the focus of someone who thought in ranges and distances, and he found himself watching the way her eyes moved across the data, quick and precise, parsing multiple variables in a way that was clearly habitual. The Vel'Sotharan chain here is outside the contracted zone, but the readings suggest subsurface thermal activity that may be worth noting. Noting in a formal report, or noting as in, let's go look. She glanced at him. The former, I do not deviate from contracted routes. Fair enough. He looked at the chart. What about this system here, the Reth Passage? The current pattern looked wrong to me when we charted the eastern entry. We didn't go in, but from the surface readings, the flow suggested a secondary channel that wasn't on any map we had. She looked where he was pointing. Her pupil narrowed in concentration. You have coordinates. Not precise ones, but I know the visual landmarks. That rock formation, he pointed to an icon on her chart. That's within 5 kilometers of where we were standing off. The passage would be northwest of it. If there is a secondary channel, it would be relevant to the 3rd contract. She looked at him. You are certain of this? I'm certain the readings suggested it. I'm not certain what's there. That is a useful distinction, she said, which might have been a compliment or might have been a statement of epistemological principle. He was beginning to enjoy not knowing which. They talked about routes for the better part of an hour. She asked precise questions and listened to the answers without filling the pauses, which was something he'd rarely encountered in a professional context and immediately appreciated. When she disagreed with him, she said so directly and explained why, and when he made a counterargument she considered it before answering, rather than waiting for him to finish talking so she could continue being right. By the time the afternoon rain came again, they had roughed out a working theory about the Reth Passage that would need field verification, and he had a tentative grasp of the contracted survey protocols she used, which were more rigorous than anything the *Peregrine Cross* had operated under and much more interesting. That evening, with the rain gone and the light dropping fast the way it did at this latitude, he built a small fire from the dried sea wrack that had accumulated on the leeward side of the rock face. It wasn't enough to keep them warm. The island didn't get cold exactly, but the wind off the open ocean had an edge to it after dark, and it wasn't enough to cook anything with, because there was nothing to cook. It was fire for the sake of light, and light for the sake of something human, and he didn't pretend otherwise. She watched it. For a long time she just watched it, the gold of her eyes picking up the flicker in a way that made them seem, if anything, more gold, and the markings along her jaw responding in some sympathetic way that he couldn't fully articulate, settling maybe, the way the fire settled once it found its own rhythm. "You make fire easily," she said. "I've had practice. Survey work involves a lot of waiting in a lot of places." He adjusted a piece of wrack at the edge of the burn. "Is fire unusual for your people?" "Not unused," she said, "but less instinctive perhaps. The first response to cold or dark is usually technical." She paused. "You built this before checking whether you had a technical alternative." "I don't have a technical alternative," he said. "The multi-tool doesn't do much in the dark except exist." "No," she said, "but you would have built it even if you had one, I think." He thought about whether that was true. He thought it probably was. "It's something to look at," he said. "Something to organize around, makes the dark feel smaller." She looked at the fire for another long moment. Then, with the care of someone who wasn't sure if the gesture was welcome, she said, "Will you tell me about the work, the survey work you were doing, not the technical parts?" She paused, choosing. "The reason you were doing it." He looked at her, a little surprised. It wasn't the question he expected. So he told her. Not the ship's contracts or the tide tables or the catalog numbers for the sections they'd mapped. He told her about the first time he'd pulled a sonar image of an unmapped seafloor and seen the shape of mountains that had never had a name, and the particular feeling that was. He tried to describe it. Not exactly ownership. Not exactly discovery. More like being the first person to be in the same room as something that already existed and had simply not been witnessed yet. He told her about the day the drone footage had come back from the Eastern Reef section, and there had been, in the background of frame 47, something none of them had a taxonomy for, moving slow and large through the deep water, and how Captain Voss had called them all in to look at it, and they'd stood around the monitor in the small hours of the morning and been very quiet. Nessa listened. The fire burned down and he fed it another piece of wrack and it came back up. "I understand that," she said when he finished, "the being in the room with it." "You do this work because of it," he said. "Don't you, not the contracts?" "The contracts fund the work," she said. "The work is," she stopped, tried again. "My people have been mapping this region for 60 years. There are still things in it that nothing knows about. That is not a problem. It is a reason to continue." He looked at her in the firelight, the bronze green of her skin gone warm and amber. The markings pulsed soft and slow. He thought, this is someone who would have gotten along well with Captain Voss, who had also believed that the reason to go was the going, and had spent 20 years doing it, and had gone down with the ship without, as far as he could tell, regretting a single passage she'd made. He didn't say any of that. He put it somewhere useful instead. "The Reth Passage," he said. "If the secondary channel is real, and I think it's real, there's something in that lagoon that nobody's looked at yet." "Yes," she said. "There probably is." "I'd like to help you look at it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. The ocean made its constant sound. "Yes," she said again, and this time it was something more than an acknowledgement. In the evening she asked him about the Peregrine Cross asterisk, and he told her what there was to tell, which wasn't much. A good crew, a competent captain, a contract that had been extended twice and was coming up on its third renewal. The squall, the waking up in the water, the island. "Do you grieve them?" she said. He thought about it. "I don't know yet," he said. "I've been too busy staying alive to know what I'm feeling." She accepted that without comment. Then, "I lost my own navigator under different circumstances. He chose to go. It was still a loss." "How long ago?" 2 months, as I said." She was looking at the ocean. "It was not a romantic matter. I want to be clear about that." "I didn't assume it was." "Some humans do," she said. "They assume certain things about the nature of relationships between beings, particularly when one of the beings is Vel'Sotharan." He didn't ask what those assumptions were. He thought he had a reasonable idea. "I'm going to be more interested in the Reth Passage than in making assumptions," he said. She looked at him then, not the evaluating look she'd been using since the first day, but something different, something that landed more quietly. "Yes," she said, "I believe you." The rescue vessel arrived in the early hours of the morning, just before dawn. It was smaller than he'd expected, a compact, fast-running survey-class ship, the hull a deep gray-green that read nearly black in the pre-dawn dark. 2 crew came ashore in a tender, a Vel'Sotharan who was clearly the ship's operations officer, jaw markings brighter and more complex than Nessa's, and a second being he couldn't immediately categorize. They both stopped when they saw him. Nessa said something in Vel'Sotharan which he didn't follow, but the tone was clear. "This is not a problem, this is handled. Do not make it into one." The operations officer looked at him for a long moment and then said something back. Nessa replied. A pause. The officer looked at Marcus again, then back at Nessa and said one more thing. Nessa said in standard, "She asks if you are cargo or crew." "Crew," Marcus said, to Nessa, not to the officer. Nessa translated this. The officer looked at him once more and then, without further ceremony, gestured toward the tender. In the tender, bouncing across the chop toward the ship, he looked back at the island once. It was already losing its specificity in the dark, just a black shape against a slightly lighter sky, nothing remarkable, a piece of rock in a large ocean that didn't care about it. "Your official status," Nessa said beside him, "will need to be documented at the first port. I can bring you aboard as a contract surveyor on a provisional basis. The paperwork is not complex." "Okay," he said. "Your species authorities will need to be notified that you are not dead." She looked at the ship, checking something in the approach. "Is there someone who should be told?" He thought about it. His sister in Meroa. The survey company's HR system, which would currently have him listed under a status he didn't want to think about too clearly. "A few people," he said. "Yes. I can send a message from the ship's communicator when we are clear of the local interference. If you write it, I will transmit it." He looked at her. The lights of the ship were getting closer, and in that light her markings were visible again, that warm copper-gold pulse that he'd been cataloging without meaning to, learning when it steadied and when it moved. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. "You said that as if it surprises you." "Not surprises," he said. "It's just—" He stopped. "What?" He thought about how to put it. "You made a deal," he said. "You laid out terms, clear conditions. You didn't say it like you were doing me a favor, you said it like it was a business arrangement." "It is a business arrangement," she said. "Yeah, but you're also sending a message to tell my sister I'm alive." Nessa was quiet for a moment. The tender pulled up to the ship's side, and the ladder was already down, and the operations officer went up first without ceremony. Nessa didn't move immediately. She looked at him in the dark, the water moving under them. "Business arrangements," she said finally. can coexist with being decent. I know, he said. I just haven't met many people who seemed sure of that. She held his gaze for a moment. The copper gold of her markings shifted, not pulsed, not flared, just moved like a breath. Then she said, "The Reth Passage. I want to investigate the secondary channel. I thought you didn't deviate from contracted routes. The third contract has an exploratory clause. I checked last night." She looked at him steadily. "If the secondary channel is there and the subsurface readings match what you described, it may qualify for supplementary documentation." He looked at her. "So you want to go look?" "I want to assess whether the data merits inclusion," she said, which was not the same thing and was also entirely the same thing. "Yeah," he said, "let's go look." She climbed the ladder. He followed. The ship was called the Vel'Sotharan, which she translated for him on the first morning as something approximately equivalent to patient course. Not a literal translation, she said, but the intent. She had named it herself. He thought it was a good name for a ship run by someone who planned 3 moves ahead and didn't waste energy on things that couldn't be helped. His quarters were small and functional, and he liked them immediately. His workstation was aft, with a view of the wake, and she'd stocked it already with the chart sets for the contracted routes, the survey protocols, and a copy of the navigational database organized in a way that took him 2 hours to understand, and then seemed obvious in retrospect. There was also, on the desk, a single sheet of documentation, a provisional crew contract, formal language in both Standard and Vel'Sotharan, a rate schedule at the bottom. He read the rate schedule twice. He went forward to find her on the bridge. He looked for the word. "This is significantly more than enough by your understanding of human standards." "No," she said, without looking up from her charts. "It is exactly enough by my understanding of human standards. I researched the standard rate for a certified survey navigator with your level of experience." A pause. "You will need to sit the Vel'Sotharan navigation certification exam at some point, but not immediately." "There's a certification exam." "There is. It is not difficult if you know the material, and you appear to know most of the material." She finally looked up. "You can prepare while we travel." He looked at the contract in his hand. He thought about the Peregrine Cross asterisk and the laminated checklist and 14 months of work he'd found satisfying without ever quite finding it enough. He thought about a volcanic rock with no name and a woman who had drunk the water he brought without thanking him until she decided she meant it. He went back to his desk and signed the contract. The Reth Passage was exactly where he remembered it. They arrived on the 8th day out, in the clear early morning light that made the water a deep and transparent green over the shallower reefs. Nessa stood at the bow of the Vel'Sotharan while he called out the landmark readings from the bridge, and when he said there, the rock formation, northwest, she held up one hand and the ship eased to a stop. She came aft to the bridge. She looked at the readings on the surface scanners. She looked at the chart. "There," she said, pointing to a zone the chart marked as uncharted shoal. "That's what I thought," he said. "Subsurface thermal differential," she said, reading the scanner. "That is consistent with a channel entrance. The water temperature on the north side of the shoal is 2 degrees below the ambient. That is not shoal behavior." "No," he said, "that's a through current." She looked at him. The morning light was full and warm on the bridge, and her skin caught it differently than it had on the island, less like bronze and more like something lit from within, the copper green of it going warm. Her markings were still in the way they went when she was focused, not pulsing, just present. "We will need to put the survey drone in," she said. "The channel, if it's real, will be too narrow for the ship." "I can run the drone," he said. "I've done it for 2 years." She nodded, which was a gesture she'd apparently picked up for situations where the Vel'Sotharan equivalent would have taken longer. "I'll monitor from here. Call your readings as you go." He ran the drone for 4 hours. The secondary channel was real, narrow and winding, but navigable for a vessel the size of a small tender, and it opened at the far end into a sheltered lagoon that the charts hadn't known existed. The lagoon had a thermal vent at its floor that was keeping the water warm and still, and according to the drone's spectral analysis, hosting a biological community that was well outside the range of anything in the regional survey database. He brought the drone back and pulled up the footage on the display and let her look at it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "This qualifies for supplementary documentation under the 3rd contract." "Yes," he said. "It will require an additional 3 days on site." "Yes." "The client will likely want to renegotiate the contract scope based on this finding." "That's usually how it works," he said. She looked at the footage for another long moment. He watched her watch it, the way her pupil tracked the movement of the biological community, the way she leaned slightly toward the screen as though closing the last few centimeters of distance between her and the data. "You were right about the current," she said. "At the eastern entry, you saw it correctly." "I had a good angle on it," he said. "I might have missed it from inside the passage." She looked at him. "You are not required to distribute credit." "I'm not distributing it. I'm being accurate." "Your drone skills, my angle, the channel exists. All 3 required." She held his gaze for a moment. Her markings shifted, that slow, warm movement, not a pulse. "Yes," she said. "All 3 required." The first port on the contracted route was Vel'Sotharan, as she'd warned. She briefed him the night before with the precision of someone who had briefed people for a long time and had learned to calibrate for varying levels of attention. He paid full attention, because the briefing was worth full attention. The port's layout, the officials he might encounter, the 2 topics he should not raise unprompted, the 3 gestures that had specific meanings in Vel'Sotharan context and should be avoided, the correct sequence for presenting his provisional crew documentation. "You are taking notes," she said partway through. "Yes," he said. "On paper." "I retain things better on paper." He looked up. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said, and something in the word sounded slightly like it surprised her. "I will continue." The port went without incident. The officials at the documentation office looked at him for a long time, and at Nessa, and at the provisional contract, and at him again, and then processed the paperwork with the specific efficiency of bureaucrats who had decided something was not their problem. He said nothing to officials without her present. He did not wander. He did not investigate independently. He followed 3 meters behind her through the covered market near the dock, where the stalls sold things he couldn't identify, and the air smelled like salt and something sweet and faintly chemical. And when she stopped at one stall and conducted a short, quiet transaction in Vel'Sotharan, he waited and did not ask. She handed him something when they returned to the ship, a small container sealed. "What is this?" he said. "A joint preparation," she said. "For the knuckles. The temperature differential between the survey drone's controls and ambient air causes inflammation in some operators, particularly in the first weeks of regular use." A pause. "The operations officer mentioned it to me. She has used the drone for 3 years." He looked at the container. His knuckles had, in fact, been aching since the Reth Passage. He hadn't mentioned it. "Thank you," he said. "It is a standard crew welfare provision," she said, and walked forward to the bridge. He stood on the aft deck with the container in his hands and thought about that for a moment. Then he put it in his pocket and went to help the operations officer with the docking lines. The second port was different, a mixed-species transit hub, large and indifferent and so accustomed to the traffic of beings from 40 systems that a human with a Vel'Sotharan crew manifest barely rated a second look. He found this genuinely relaxing in a way that surprised him. Anonymity, he thought, had its uses. Nessa used the port stop to resupply and to meet with a representative from the second contracted client. a survey company whose main office was 3 systems over, and whose local coordinator was a small, quick-talking being that Marcus couldn't immediately classify and didn't need to. Because Nessa handled all of the meeting and he sat to her left and kept his hands on the table and his observations to himself as instructed. The meeting went long. Afterward, walking back through the port's lower transit level, he said, the part where they tried to renegotiate the scope terms. Yes, she said. That wasn't in the original contract. No, she said. It was an attempt to expand the deliverables without adjusting the fee. She walked with the particular straightness of someone who was choosing not to be annoyed. I have encountered this client before. What happens if you push back? They accept the original terms, she said. They try this with every contractor. It is a habit, not a strategy. She paused. I did not push back in the meeting. I will send the formal response from the ship. In writing, it is easier to be precise. You prefer precise to quick, he said. She glanced at him. Don't you? He thought about it. Yes, actually, I just hadn't put it that way. She made the sound that was adjacent to amusement. Most humans I have worked with prefer to resolve conflict verbally and immediately, in the room. It feels more decisive. It usually just means someone says something they can't take back, he said. She was quiet for a moment, and he got the sense she was filing this away in the same place she filed the other things he said that she found useful. He'd come to recognize the quality of that silence. It was different from the other silences, which were various. He was learning the vocabulary of them. There is a food stall, she said, on the upper level, a Vel'Sotharan operator. The preparation is it will not harm you, and I think you will find it worthwhile. Are you recommending food to me? He said. I am informing you of an option, she said. That's the same thing. The corner of her mouth moved. The upper level, she said. The food was worthwhile. He couldn't have described what it was exactly. Something involving a grain-like base, and a sauce that was sweet in a way that started at the back of the palate rather than the front. But it was warm and filling, and he ate all of it while she ate hers in order of temperature, warm elements first, which meant she started with the sauce and worked back to the room temperature grain base. And he watched this with the interest of someone who had been curious about it since she mentioned it on the island. Does it change the taste? He said, eating in temperature order. Yes, she said, significantly. She looked at him. The cold elements taste different when the palate is warm. They read more clearly. Oh, he said. He looked at his empty bowl, which he'd eaten in no particular order and which had tasted excellent. I might try that. You won't, she said without judgment. No, he agreed, but I thought about it. They were 2 weeks out of that port, crossing the transit section between the 2nd and 3rd, contracted survey zones when it rained. Not the brief afternoon rain of the island, a real storm, the kind that the Vel'Sotharan*S weather system flagged 12 hours ahead and downgraded twice, and then upgraded sharply at 300. He was on watch when the upgrade came in. He ran the ship through the standard heavy weather protocol, which was close enough to what he knew to follow without difficulty, and had her secured and her course adjusted before Nessa appeared on the bridge in the dark. She looked at the instruments. She looked at what he'd done. She didn't say anything immediately. I followed the protocol in the weather manual, he said. I improvised the ballast adjustment slightly. The cross-sea component was running about 15 degrees off what the protocol assumed, so I compensated. The ballast adjustment is correct, she said, reading the readout. The protocol is written for a standard cross-sea configuration. You identified the deviation. It wasn't hard to see. She stood beside him at the console, watching the forward display where the wave pattern was visible in the ship's light. The storm was loud against the hull, the kind of loud that you stop hearing after a while because it becomes the ambient condition of existence. You are comfortable at night watch, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I prefer it usually, he said. It's quieter, you see things more clearly. She was quiet for a moment. Then, tell me the thing you were going to say on the tender when you didn't finish. He looked at her. Which thing? When you said it's just and stopped. She kept her eyes on the forward display. You said that and stopped. You have not come back to it. He hadn't thought she'd remembered that, or more precisely, he hadn't thought she'd bring it back. He should have known better by now. I was going to say, he said carefully, that I've been in a fair number of professional arrangements with people who were competent and reasonable, and most of them didn't feel like this. He stopped. Like what? The storm made the ship shudder. He braced automatically, reading the motion. Like I'm somewhere I'm supposed to be, he said. That's not a very professional observation. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the ship climbed one significant wave and came down the other side, and he had a moment to wonder if he'd got this entirely wrong. No, she said, it is not a professional observation. Another pause, but it is an accurate one. He looked at her. She was still watching the forward display, but she had turned marginally in a way that put them both facing the same direction, closer than the width of the console required. The deal, she said, the terms, what I told you on the island. I remember. I was accurate, she said. All of that was accurate, a pause. It was also not complete. No, he said, I didn't think it was. She turned to look at him then fully, those gold eyes steady. Her markings were doing the slow warm thing, the thing that he'd catalogued over 2 weeks and still didn't have the right word for. This region, she said, the survey work. I have been doing it alone with crew that changed frequently for 4 years. I was accustomed to that. Yeah, he said, I know the feeling. I don't think the Reth Passage would have been found, she said, if I had still been accustomed to it. He held her gaze. The storm was loud and the ship was steady, and he was exactly where he'd told her he was, somewhere he was supposed to be. I want to be clear, he said carefully, about what I'm about to say. Say it. We've got contracts to finish. The 3rd survey zone and the Vel'Sotharan notation and whatever comes after. I want to finish them. That's real and it's separate. Yes, she said. And I'm aware that we've known each other 2 weeks, and one of those weeks was partly an emergency, and those are not ideal conditions for clarity. Yes, she said again. She wasn't looking away. But, he said, I would like at some point when the 3rd zone is done and the contracts are filed to know whether this is something we're doing. This, she said. This, he didn't gesture, he didn't need to. Her markings did the thing that he now understood, he thought, or was getting closer to understanding. They moved slowly, warmly, settling. The way a thing settles when it arrives somewhere it had been heading. We are already doing it, she said. We have been doing it since the tender. He looked at her. Since you offered me the job. Since you asked what it paid, she said, and meant it as a real question, not as a performance of not caring. She paused. Most beings offered rescue perform not caring about the cost. You actually wanted to know. He thought about that, because the answer mattered to what I was going to do. Yes, she said. You take things seriously, you don't posture about them. She looked at him. It is unusual. I have been thinking about it since the island. He was quiet for a moment. The storm shifted in pitch, the cross-sea angle moving, and he made a minor course correction on instinct and then looked back at her. I need to tell you something, he said. Tell me. I find you, he thought about it. There were several words that were accurate and several that were insufficient. He picked the one that was both accurate and sufficient. Remarkable, he said, not because you're not as a category, as a specific person, the way you think. The way you handled the island without wasting anything, including your own energy on panic. The briefings, the Reth Passage, he paused. The joint preparation. The corner of her mouth moved. Not the brief smile she'd given on the island, something steadier. The joint preparation was a standard crew welfare provision, she said, with the same inflection she'd used then, which he now realized was a kind of humor. Yeah, he said, I know. She looked at him for a long moment. Her markings were fully settled now, warm and steady against the bronze green of her skin in the bridge's dark. We will finish the third survey zone, she said, and file the contracts, and then. And then, he agreed. She turned back to the forward display. He stayed where he was, which was next to her, the width of the console between them, watching the storm. The Reth Passage, she said after a moment. Yeah. The exploratory clause on the third contract. The client will want to revisit the scope. She looked at him. There may be follow-on work, a more detailed survey of the lagoon and the thermal system. There usually is, he said, when you find something. Yes, she looked at the display. I would not want to do it with a different navigator. He looked at the storm and thought about a life raft with no name and a seep that barely kept a man alive, and 3 flares he hadn't had to use. He thought about a volcanic rock with no name that had already given him more than it had any reason to. You won't have to, he said. The Vel'Sotharan held its course through the storm, steady and patient, exactly as named. Outside, the ocean did what oceans do, vast and indifferent and full of things no chart had yet accounted for. Inside, the bridge was warm and quiet under the noise, and the instruments held their readings, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which was, he had learned in 2 weeks, the Vel'Sotharan equivalent of saying everything. The third survey zone took 11 days. The subsurface readings in the southern half were more complex than the charts suggested, a series of interlocking thermal ridges that required methodical cross-referencing. And he ran the drone every morning while she processed the previous day's data, and they went through the readings each evening over the meal she ate in order of temperature, and he ate in whatever order seemed right, which she had stopped commenting on by the 5th day. On the 9th day, he passed his provisional navigation certification. She had said it wasn't difficult if he knew the material. She had been correct. The exam was administered remotely from the nearest Vel'Sotharan Navigation Bureau, proctored through the ship's communication system, and took him 3 hours. When the certification came through, she was at the console doing something with the thermal ridge data, and she looked up when the system chimed. You passed, she said. I passed. On the first attempt, a pause. Many candidates take the exam twice. You said the material wasn't difficult. It isn't. She looked at the certification on the screen. Congratulations, she said, in the specific tone of someone who means the thing they're saying and is not sure how much of the feeling to let through. Thank you, he said in the same tone. She turned back to the thermal ridge data. He went to make tea, which was the one thing he'd found in the ship's galley that was both compatible with his system and something he actually wanted. He made 2 cups, because somewhere in the 2nd week he'd established that she would drink the tea if it was there, though she wouldn't ask for it. He put both cups on the console. She picked up hers without looking away from the data. On the 11th day, they completed the 3rd survey zone and filed the contracts. He was at his desk when the filing confirmation came through, doing the final notation on the Reth Passage documentation. He heard her come aft. Her footsteps were distinctive, heavier than a human's and precise, always on the same path, and she stopped in the doorway of his quarters. Filed, she said. I saw. He finished the notation and set down the stylus. The client will respond within 2 days typically, she said. Yes. She was leaning in the doorway, not quite in the room, in the way she did sometimes when she had something to say and was deciding how to say it. He had learned to wait. The follow-on work for the lagoon, she said. The client's response to the Reth Passage documentation was already positive. The preliminary inquiry came in this morning. He looked at her, already. Thermal vent biology in an undocumented lagoon, she said. They are interested. A pause. The scope would be significant, 3 months minimum, possibly 5. Right, he said. The contract would be a full crew contract, not a provisional one. You would need to be registered in the Navigation Bureau as a certified crew member on this vessel's manifest. She looked at him steadily. That is a different kind of commitment than the provisional arrangement. I know what it means, he said. Yes, she said. I know you do, she paused. I'm telling you because she stopped. Because you should make the decision with complete information, she said. Not because I am assuming the answer. He looked at her for a moment. Nessa. Yes. I signed a contract on this ship, he said, 2 weeks ago on paper, because I retain things better on paper. He waited a beat. I'm not in the habit of signing things I don't mean. She looked at him for a long moment. The copper gold of her markings moved, the slow, settling warmth of them. No, she said, I don't think you are. He turned back to his desk and picked up the stylus. Send me the new contract when it comes in, he said. I'll sign it on paper. She made a sound low and brief, and it was the closest thing to a laugh he'd heard from her, and it was enough. Yes, she said. I will. She left the doorway, and he could hear her footsteps going forward to the bridge, steady and precise, taking the same path they always took. He sat with the Reth Passage documentation for a moment, looking at the notes they'd built together, his angle, her drone, the channel that the charts hadn't known existed. He thought about the island, the overhang that leaked, and the rain that came exactly on schedule, and a being who had drunk the water without thanking him until she decided she meant it. He added one final note to the documentation. In the margin, in the handwriting that she had learned to read over 2 weeks because his annotations were sometimes faster than the system input. Secondary channel verified, recommended for priority classification on follow-on contract. Full survey warranted, recommend same crew. He filed it with the contract package and went forward to the bridge. The ocean was doing what oceans do, vast and green and full of things no chart had yet accounted for. Nessa was at the console, reading the preliminary inquiry from the client, her gold eyes moving quickly down the text. She didn't look up when he came in. She didn't need to. He took his place at the navigation station. The Vel'Sotharan sailed on.